Before we start, in every era of the American drug trade, the most feared men were not always the kingpins, not always the men who built the empires. Sometimes the most feared men were the ones who robbed the empires, the stick-up kids, the men who looked at the most powerful drug organizations in their city, operations generating hundreds of thousands of dollars per day, operations with armies of workers and enforcers, and violence infrastructure built specifically to protect what they had built, and decided to take it anyway, not because they had more men, not because they had more power, because they had less to lose. The stick-up kids didn't build empires, they took them. And the kingpins who ran the most dangerous underground economies in American history, the men that entire neighborhoods feared, would lay awake at night thinking about the men in this compilation. Because there was nothing more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose and everything to take. This compilation is about those men, the stick-up kid who terrified the kingpins. We start in Queens and the Bronx. Number 1, the Bolden brothers, Queens and the Bronx, the Jesse James gang of New York. Queens, New York, 1986. Fat Cat Nichols is locked up. He is fighting his case from inside. His operation is still running. His stash houses are still active. His money is still moving through South Jamaica, Queens, even without him physically present to direct it. He thinks his stash is protected. He is wrong. A group of men who the streets called the Bolden brothers have been watching which houses hold the product, which houses hold the money. When the workers change shifts, who comes and who goes. And when they are ready, they move. They take one of Fat Cat's stash houses, $100,000 in money and drugs. Gone. That one detail tells you everything you need to know about who the Bolden brothers were. Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols, the man who ran one of the most sophisticated drug organizations in Queens history, the man whose headquarters at Big Mac's Deli had become the center of the South Jamaica drug trade, the man whose enforcers included Howard Pappy Mason, one of the most feared killers in New York City history, got robbed while he was locked up, $100,000, by a crew from the Bronx and Queens. That is the Bolden brothers. Curtis, Henry, Ernest, Robert, and their cousin Isaac. The streets called Isaac Just Me. The Bolden brothers were to the Bronx and Queens what the Jesse James gang were to the Old West. That description, preserved in the verified true crime writing of Seth Ferranti, the most credible chronicler of American street history, captures exactly what they were. Vicious marauders who didn't give a single thought to who they were robbing or what those people were capable of doing in response. Fat Cat, the Supreme Team, Pretty Tony, their counterparts from Harlem, Alpo, Rich Porter, Aziz, every major operator in the New York crack era who the documentaries celebrate, the Bolden brothers had robbed them or robbed someone connected to them. They didn't discriminate. They didn't strategize around who was more dangerous than someone else. If you had money or product, you were a target. Simple as that. But here is the detail that separates the Bolden brothers' story from every other stick-up kid story in New York history. Isaac Just Me, the cousin, the Queens connection, the man who grew up in the same South Jamaica geography as Fat Cat and the Supreme Team. Fat Cat knew him personally, knew him well enough to go back to jail specifically to visit him. When Just Me got out of prison, Fat Cat gave him money, got him a job at Imperial Homes, the construction company Fat Cat was connected to. Tried to pull his childhood friend back from the edge of the life that was going to get him killed. Isaac Just Me took the money, took the job, and fell in with Henry Bolden from the Bronx, and started robbing everyone, including Fat Cat's stash house, $100,000, from the man who had gone back to prison just to visit him, who had given him money and a job when he got out. The response from Fat Cat and from Prince of the Supreme Team was immediate and specific. Prince was sleeping with two corrupt New York State Parole Division employees, parole officer Ina McGriff and her secretary Ronnie Younger. Prince used both of them. He got the home addresses of Isaac Just Me Bolden and his cousin Henry Bolden, their home addresses, the places where their families lived, the specific information that turned a robbery dispute into something much more devastating. August 6, 1987, Isaac Just Me. Bolden was killed in front of his mother's house in Queens, not in a stash house, not on a corner, not during a robbery, in front of his mother's house. Henry Bolden was shot at his address in the Bronx. He survived, and according to documented street history, he went right back to robbing. The aftermath revealed the full depth of what Prince had done. Parole officer Ina McGriff saw a newspaper article reporting Isaac Bolden's murder. She asked Prince whether this was the same Bolden she had given him information about. Prince just smirked. That smirk is the specific image that tells you everything about what just happened. A corrupt parole officer who had given up a man's home address asked whether the man she gave up was now dead, and the man who asked for that address did nothing but smirk. Isaac Just Me Bolden, the stick-up kid who robbed Fat Cat's stash house for $100,000, who was given a second chance by a childhood friend who loved him enough to go back to prison just to visit him, who took that second chance and kept robbing anyway, killed in front of his mother's house, by the information provided by the woman his killer was sleeping with. The Jesse James Gang of New York. Number 1. Number 2, Kelvin Martin, Fort Greene, Brooklyn, the original 50 Cent. Fort Greene, Brooklyn, 1984. A man is walking down Myrtle Avenue. He is 5 feet 2 inches tall, 120 pounds. He has 2 guns in his waistband simultaneously. A Colt 45, a .357 Magnum. He is walking through one of Brooklyn's most active streets in the middle of the day, open, visible, completely unconcerned about who sees him or what they think about what they are seeing, because in Fort Greene, in the mid-1980s, everyone already knows what this man is, and everyone already knows what he will do to them if they get in his way. His name is Kelvin Martin. The streets of Brooklyn called him something else. 50 Centine, not Curtis Jackson, not the rapper from Queens, the original. The man whose name a 12-year-old boy in Jamaica, Queens would eventually take as a tribute after hearing the legends that had spread across all 5 boroughs about what Kelvin Martin was. Kelvin Martin grew up in the Bronx. He moved to Brooklyn as a teenager. The Ingersoll projects in Fort Greene, the public housing development that would become the specific geography of everything he built his reputation on. He was small, 5 feet 2, 120 pounds. In the specific economy of the streets, where size and physical intimidation are the primary currencies of respect, Kelvin Martin's body was a liability that could have defined him as someone to be overlooked. He turned it into an advantage, because the brazenness required to walk down Myrtle Avenue with 2 long-barrel handguns in your waistband at 120 pounds in the middle of the day announced something specific to everyone who saw it. This man does not calculate risk the way other men calculate risk. This man is not afraid of you. The name 50 Cent came from that specific quality. 3 different origin stories circulate, all of them pointing to the same thing, that he would rob anyone for any amount, no minimum, Store clerks, rival crooks, hustlers, anyone on Myrtle Avenue who had something worth taking. He once entered a dice game with 50 cents. He walked away with $500. The audacity of showing up to a street dice game with 50 cents in Fort Greene in the 1980s, where the men playing those games were not patient about being disrespected and winning. That is who Kelvin Martin was. And then the celebrity robberies started. LL Cool J, James Todd Smith from Hollis, Queens. At that point in the mid-1980s, one of the most recognized figures in hip-hop. His jewelry announced his status everywhere he went. Kelvin Martin found him in a Brooklyn parking lot, took his chain, didn't keep it, gave it to his daughter Shakia. That detail, taking LL Cool J's chain and giving it to his daughter instead of wearing it himself, tells you something specific about who Kelvin Martin was outside the brazenness. He wasn't robbing for status. He wasn't robbing to wear what he took and announce what he had done. He was robbing because taking was what he did. The chain was for his daughter. He also had a run-in with Jam Master Jay of Run DMC. A confrontation between Martin's Brooklyn Zoo crew and Jay's Hollis crew turned into a shootout. And then, the friendship that nobody expected, Eric Barrier, Eric B. The DJ half of Eric B. and Rakim, one of the most respected hip-hop acts of the 1980s. The man behind the record that defined an ERA. Paid in full, Eric B. knew Kelvin Martin. The two became close in 1986, close enough that Martin became a member of the Paid in Full posse. The specific Brooklyn and Queens collective that surrounded Eric B. and Rakim as they were building the most important hip-hop album of their careers. The back of the Paid in Full album, there is a photo, Brooklyn hustlers and hip-hop figures gathered together. Kelvin Martin is in that photo. 5'2", 120 pounds, 2 guns in his waistband, standing with the men who were making the music that the whole world was about to hear. The title track of Paid in Full, the song that defined Rakim's legacy, is about the stick-up life, about the specific calculation a man makes when he looks at what's available to him and decides that taking is faster than building. Rakim chose the microphone. Kelvin Martin chose Myrtle Avenue. October 20th, 1987. Kelvin Martin is in the stairway of his girlfriend's building in Crown Heights. A man named Julio Wemo Acevedo shoots him. He is taken to Kings County Hospital. 4 days later, October 24th, Kelvin Martin dies. He is 23 years old. The man who robbed LL Cool J and gave his daughter the chain, who walked Myrtle Avenue with 2 guns in his waistband at 5'2" and 120 pounds, who made it onto the back of Paid in Full, who made Fort Greene understand that size was nothing against brazenness. Gone at 23. In Jamaica, Queens, a 12-year-old boy named Curtis Jackson is growing up in a world where his mother has just been murdered. The legends of Kelvin Martin, 50 Cent, the Brooklyn stick-up kid who robbed anyone for anything, have spread across all 5 boroughs. They reach Queens. They reach Curtis Jackson. Years later, when Curtis Jackson steps into the world of hip-hop under the name 50 Cent, he explains the choice directly. He took the name as a tribute, as an acknowledgement of what Kelvin Martin represented, the audacity, the fearlessness, the specific quality of a man who would rob anyone for any amount because fear was simply not part of his operating system. In 2025, Kelvin Darnell Martin's grave in Silver Mount Cemetery on Staten Island has a headstone shaped like a $50 coin. Red Indian granite, circular, gold chrome lettering, the number 50, put there by Curtis Jackson, the rapper who built a billion-dollar empire on the name that a 5'2" stick-up kid from Fort Greene, Brooklyn made famous. on a street where Kelvin Martin once walked with 2 guns in his waistband and nobody said a word. The original 50 Cent. Southeast Washington, D.C., 1987. A man named Tony Kenyon is walking through the 3300 block of 14th Place. He is 29 years old. He doesn't make it to the end of the block. Someone shoots him in the chest. He dies on the street. The shooter is not a grown man with a reputation built over years. The shooter is a teenager, a boy so young that when DC detectives start building the case, pulling witnesses, running the name, tracing the weapon, they keep coming back to the same detail that stops them cold. How old? Later that same year, December 6th, another man is killed. Matthew Blake, shot dead during a gunfight on Camden Street Southeast. Same name comes back. Same teenager. In May of the following year, a third shooting. Levin Hill survived. Assault with intent to kill. Same name. Then Prince George's County, December 1988. A man named Andre Smith, shot dead at the Crystal Skate Rink on Branch Avenue. Murder and rape charges filed. Same name. 4 separate incidents. 4 separate jurisdictions. 4 separate cases building simultaneously against one person. That person is not a gang leader, not a kingpin with an organization behind him, not a man with decades of street experience who has built up to this level of violence gradually. He is a teenager from Berry Farm, Southeast DC, a boy the streets call Shorty Pop. And here is the detail that makes this story unlike anything else in Washington, D.C.'s history. While the police were building those 4 cases, while the bodies were stacking up across Southeast and Prince George's County, while D.C. detectives were pulling warrants and issuing bench warrants and trying to locate a teenager who had accumulated more criminal exposure in 2 years than most men manage in a lifetime, the record label Def Jam was preparing to release music by his band. The same boy, the same Berry Farm streets, a Def Jam recording artist, and a murder suspect in 4 separate jurisdictions simultaneously. This is the story of Shelton Watkins. The streets called him Shorty Pop. Southeast Washington, D.C. sits across the Anacostia River from the Capitol Dome, 2 miles. That is the distance between the most powerful government building in the world and one of the most underserved public housing projects in America. Berry Farm, built in the 1860s as housing for formerly enslaved people freed during the Civil War. Originally a community of self-sufficient black homeowners who had purchased their own land. Over the following century, as public housing policy reshaped the neighborhood, it became something different. Government towers rose on Stanton Road, Wade Road, and Knox Place in the heart of Southeast. By the 1970s, Berry Farm was already under pressure from disinvestment, underfunded schools, and an economy with narrow doors for the people who grew up there. Shelton Watkins grew up inside all of that. But he also grew up watching something that existed nowhere else in America. Go-go music, a hybrid of funk, soul, and percussion that DC had developed as its own specific sound, with the godfather of go-go, Chuck Brown, building something in Southeast and Northeast that the rest of the country could not replicate because you had to be from DC to fully understand what it was expressing. In Berry Farm, children who could not afford instruments found another way. Hubcaps beaten with sticks, plastic buckets upside down, metal crates, empty cans, discarded pots and pans scavenged from the neighborhood. In 1980, a group of children from Berry Farm, ranging from 8 to 13 years old, started playing these improvised instruments at informal performances in the neighborhood. Locals called them the Junkyard Band. Shelton Watkins was the lead singer. 8 years old, 9 years old, singing in a band of children playing garbage on Berry Farm streets. That is where this story starts. Not on a corner, not with a weapon, playing junk. The band kept playing. Through the early 1980s, as the children of Berry Farm grew older and the Junkyard Band developed from an informal neighborhood performance into something more organized, Shelton Watkins grew up alongside it. But Southeast Washington, D.C., in the early 1980s, was not just a place where go-go music was developing, it was a war zone. The crack cocaine epidemic that would eventually turn Washington, D.C. into the murder capital of America was building block by block through Southeast. The money it generated was visible in ways that nothing legitimate in Berry Farm had ever been visible. Cars, jewelry, cash that moved through the neighborhood like weather, appearing suddenly, disappearing suddenly, always connected to the men willing to do what the money required. Shelton Watkins watched it. He watched the men who had it. He watched what they did to get it and what they did to keep it. He watched what happened to the men who challenged them and what happened to the men who served them. And he made a calculation. Not impulsively, not in the heat of some single transformative moment. A calculation. He stepped into the street life as a hitter, not a dealer building a corner, not a runner moving product for someone else's organization, not someone working his way up through a hierarchy. A hitter. The specific role in the underground economy that required one thing above everything else: the willingness to do what other people could not. In a world where violence was currency, where the credible threat of it was what made organizations function and territories hold, a man who could be counted on to handle the most extreme problems was worth more than almost anyone else. Violence as currency changed the math of value in the streets. Shorty Pop discovered early that this was what he was built for. Not reluctantly, not after a period of trying other options and finding them closed. He was built for this the way some people are built for music. The specific combination of fearlessness and calm and the ability to make decisions under pressure that would freeze most people, it came to him naturally, built for it, from the start. Southeast D.C. in the early 1980s was a proving ground. Every block had its hierarchy. Every corner had its politics. Every dispute had consequences that could escalate faster than most teenagers could process. Shorty Pop processed them instantly. He moved through Southeast with the specific authority of someone who the streets had already decided was not to be tested. Not because he was the biggest, not because he had the most people behind him, because of what he was willing to do. And what he was willing to do, at an age when most of his peers were still figuring out what the game was, had already made his name mean something in Southeast Washington, D.C. By 15, the streets called him Shorty Pop. And Shorty Pop was already one of the most feared people in Chocolate City. Not feared the way a neighborhood is feared, the way bad weather is feared. Feared the way a specific person is feared, the way that makes men who are themselves dangerous speak a name carefully. At 15 years old, 1985, Southeast Washington, D.C. A man named Alberto Martinez is in the city. He is not from D.C. He is from East Harlem, the same streets that had produced Rich Porter, the same world that would eventually become the paid-in-full mythology that defined a generation of hip-hop culture. Alpo was building, a cocaine operation moving product from New York into the nation's capital, looking for infrastructure, looking for people who knew D.C. in the way that only people from D.C. could know it. The streets, the politics, the specific geography of power in Southeast and Northeast, and the corridors where product moved and money changed hands. He needed people he could trust. In Southeast D.C., trust was earned through one thing: what you were willing to do. Someone brought Alpo to a corner where a 15-year-old from Berry Farm was operating. The meeting was not planned, not arranged through layers of introduction the way business meetings work. It happened the way things happen in that world, organically, through proximity, through the specific gravity that draws people who operate at extreme levels toward each other. Alpo looked at Shorty Pop, 15 years old, small. The name literally described his stature, Shorty. And what Alpo saw in this teenager from Berry Farm was something that surprised him. Not size, not age, not any of the external qualities that men in that world normally use to evaluate other men. He saw what DC already knew. This boy had no fear of consequences, not the recklessness that comes from not understanding danger, something different and more unsettling, the specific quality of a person who understood exactly what the consequences were and had decided they did not matter. Alpo later described the meeting in words that have circulated through DC street legend ever since. Through Pop, a young wild 15-year-old coming out of Southeast DC, killing anything moving, I met the cat, Wayne. Wayne Perry. That sentence contains the entire story of what Shorty Pop was at 15 years old. Killing anything moving. Not a metaphor, not street exaggeration. Alpo Martinez, a man who built one of the most violent drug organizations in DC history, who himself ordered and facilitated murders, who the streets of New York and DC feared in ways that most men never achieve, described a 15-year-old from Berry Farm with the specific AWE that men who deal in violence reserve for people who are genuinely extraordinary at it. Pop introduced Alpo to Wayne Perry, and that introduction, made by a 15-year-old boy who had started a go-go band at 8 years old on Berry Farm streets, changed Washington, D.C. forever. Wayne Perry was already something D.C. talked about carefully. The streets called him Silk, not because he was smooth, in the way the nickname implies for most people, because his violence was smooth, efficient, without hesitation or drama. The kind of violence that other violent men described with the vocabulary of craft, the way a surgeon might describe a difficult procedure, or a boxer might describe a perfect combination. Wayne Perry did not perform violence. He administered it. He had grown up in D.C., had been doing time for murder when Alpo arrived from New York, was sitting in a D.C. jail cell, and nobody was coming. Not his crew, not the people he had put in work for, not the men who had benefited from his specific willingness to do what other people could not. Nobody came. The people who were supposed to come up with bail money decided the calculation did not work in their favor. They left Wayne Perry in that cell. Alpo heard about it. He went to the jail, put up the money, bailed Wayne Perry out. When Perry walked out of that jail cell, he made a decision about what Alpo's loyalty was worth. He became Alpo's enforcer, and the DC cocaine trade shifted overnight. Because the thing about Wayne Perry, the thing that made DC Police Commander Donald Hilbring eventually describe him as the most dangerous man the department had ever encountered, was not just that he was willing to use violence. It was that he was willing to use it anywhere, at any time, against anyone. There was no location that made Perry hesitate, no time of day, no public setting, no level of visibility that made him calculate differently. He walked up to men in broad daylight, in crowded areas, on streets with witnesses, and he did what he came to do and walked away. The story that circulated through DC captures it precisely. A dispute over a corner. A New York dealer telling a young kid from Alpo's crew that he could not hustle in his spot. Alpo and Perry both present. Perry telling the kid to go back to the corner and stand his ground. As soon as the New York dealer came back around, Perry stepped out from beside a building and shot him in the head with everything he had in the clip, then walked away. When police arrived, Perry came back in different clothes just to watch, to see who was talking to the cops. That was Wayne Perry, a man who killed and then returned to watch the aftermath out of curiosity. Alpo's operation moved 30 kilograms per day at peak. 30 kilograms per day. Nobody touched it, because touching Alpo meant touching silk. And that calculation, the specific arithmetic of what it would cost to challenge a man who had Wayne Perry at his side, made Alpo untouchable in a city that was itself one of the most violent in America. All of it started with Shorty Pop, a 15-year-old boy making an introduction before he was old enough to vote. Here is where the story becomes something that no screenwriter could invent. Because while Shorty Pop was building his street reputation, while the bodies were accumulating, and while the DC detectives were building their cases, the Junkyard Band was climbing. The same years, the same streets, the same Berry Farm, two completely separate trajectories running simultaneously inside one human being. On one side, the music. The Junkyard Band had grown from informal neighborhood performances into something that the broader DC go-go scene was paying serious attention to. They had developed their sound, the percussion-heavy call and response energy that made go-go a specific gift to American music. They were playing larger venues, attracting larger audiences, and moving from Berry Farm streets into the DC music ecosystem that was generating real commercial interest from outside the city. Def Jam came calling. Def Jam in the mid-1980s was the most important hip-hop label in America. It was founded by Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons in 1984. LL Cool J, the Beastie Boys, run DMC. It was the institution that was taking hip-hop from a New York underground phenomenon into a global commercial force. Def Jam signed the Junkyard Band. Children from the Berry Farm Housing Project, who had started making music on hubcaps and plastic buckets because they had no other instruments, signed to the most important hip-hop label in the world. Their songs, Sardines and The Word, were recorded and released. Shelton Watkins, Shorty Pop, lead singer of the original lineup on Def Jam Records. On the other side, the streets. While the Junkyard Band was recording with Def Jam, DC Metropolitan Police detectives were accumulating cases against the lead singer. 1987, Tony Kenyon shot dead on 14th Place. Shelton Walker wanted for murder. December of the same year, Matthew N. Blake killed in a shootout on Camden Street. Same name on the warrant, May of the following year. Levin Hill shot on Georgia Avenue. Assault with intent to kill. Same name, December 1988. Andre Smith murdered at the Crystal Skate Rink in Prince George's County. Murder and rape charges filed. A bench warrant issued for failure to appear. 4 jurisdictions. 4 separate sets of charges. Murder, assault with intent to kill, rape, the same person who was listed as a recording artist on a Def Jam release, the same person who had started a band at 8 years old playing hubcaps on Berry Farm streets. Both things true simultaneously. The detectives building the cases against Shorty Pop and the label executives managing the Junkyard Band's career were operating in completely parallel universes, both of them organized around the same teenager from Southeast Washington, D.C., who existed fully in each world without either world fully containing him. That is the impossible contradiction that nobody has ever told properly about Shorty Pop. Not just that he was young and violent, not just that he was connected to Alpo and Wayne Perry, but that while all of that was happening, while the murder charges were stacking, and the warrants were being issued, and DC detectives were building a case file that would follow him for years. He was on Def Jam Records, Southeast Washington, D.C., Barry Farm. Today, the Junkyard Band is still active. 45 years after a group of children from Barry Farm started banging on hubcaps and plastic buckets on the streets of Southeast Washington, D.C., the band still plays. It still carries the specific sound of D.C. go-go that they helped define. It still performs across the city and beyond. Their Wikipedia page lists Shorty Pop as a past member, lead singer, original lineup. That is the only official public record that connects Shelton Watkins to something that most people would call positive. One line on a Wikipedia page, lead singer, original lineup. Against that one line, 4 murder cases, multiple assault charges, warrants across 2 jurisdictions, a bench warrant for failure to appear, a son who grew up without him. His son, who spoke publicly in a 40-minute interview about his father, described what it meant to grow up carrying that name in Southeast Washington, D.C. Not the famous son of a famous man, not the child of someone whose legacy was celebrated. The son of a legend that D.C. told in 2 different voices. In one voice, the street legend, Shorty Pop. The 15-year-old who Alpo Martinez described as killing anything moving. The boy who introduced 2 of the most feared men in D.C. history to each other. The hitter who built a reputation before most teenagers had their first job. In another voice, the musician, the lead singer, the child who banged on a hubcap at 8 years old and made something beautiful from what Barry Farm discarded. His son inherited both versions of the name, both versions of the legacy, both versions of the weight that comes from being the child of someone the streets remember, but the law never fully resolved. His father had been murdered. The specific circumstances, like so much of Shorty Pop's story, live in the oral history of Southeast Washington, D.C., rather than in any official public record. No arrest publicly recorded, no trial, no verdict. Just the knowledge, passed down through Barry Farm, through Southeast, through the go-go community that remembered Shelton Watkins as both a singer and a shooter, that he was gone, and what he left behind. Not property, not money, not a legitimate legacy that his son could point to. The knowledge that his father had been 2 things simultaneously that the world usually insists are mutually exclusive, a musician and a killer, both real, both Barry Farm, both the same boy who started making music from garbage at 8 years old and was dead before he turned 30. The crack era in Washington, D.C. killed an entire generation, not metaphorically. In 1990, Washington, D.C. recorded 472 murders in a city of 600,000 people, a murder rate that put it at the top of every list of the most violent cities in America. The boys who came of age in Barry Farm and Southeast and Northeast during those years faced a set of options that most Americans never had to navigate. Go-go music was one option, the streets were another. Shelton Watkins chose both, not sequentially, not first one, then the other, both simultaneously. A Def Jam recording artist and a murder suspect in 4 jurisdictions at the same time. The crack era did not ask the children who grew up inside it to choose one thing. It presented both doors simultaneously and let them walk through whichever one was open. Sometimes both doors were open at the same time. Shorty Pop walked through both and paid the price that the streets have always charged for the men who try to live in 2 worlds at once. The Junkyard Band is still playing. The charges against Shelton Walker are still in the D.C. or public record. His son is still carrying the name. And the introduction that a 15-year-old boy made on a Southeast D.C. corner in 1985, the moment that connected Alpo Martinez to Wayne Perry and changed the trajectory of Washington, D.C.'s most violent decade, remains the most consequential thing that Shorty Pop ever did before he could vote. New York City, 1985. A man is leaving a club on the Lower East Side, gold chain around his neck, cash in his pocket. The kind of night where everything feels like it belongs to you, where the music was right and the city outside feels like yours. He doesn't see it coming. Someone steps out of the dark, takes the chain, takes the cash, takes everything worth taking, and disappears before anyone can process what just happened. No name given, no face remembered clearly, just gone, back into the Brooklyn night like he was never there. But everyone in that world knows who does this. His name moves through the underground economy of New York the way fire moves through dry grass. Dealers talk about him. Kingpins warn their people about him. Men who have built reputations through years of violence speak his name with a specific kind of respect, the kind reserved for someone who operates by rules that even the most dangerous men in the room don't fully understand. He robbed everyone: dealers, runners, kingpins, and eventually the most famous rappers in New York City. Men with bodyguards and reputations and the kind of street credibility that was supposed to make them untouchable. Nobody was untouchable to him, and the greatest rapper who ever lived, the God MC himself, put him on his album cover. His name was Benjamin O'Garrow. Fort Greene, Brooklyn. They called him Killer Ben N. Fort Greene, Brooklyn, 1960s and 70s. The Walt Whitman houses sit on Myrtle Avenue in one of Brooklyn's most historically layered neighborhoods, named after the poet who lived in Fort Greene in the 19th century. Walt Whitman, the man who wrote Leaves of Grass, who celebrated the democratic American spirit, who believed in the dignity of every human life, had his name on a housing project that would become one of the most dangerous addresses in the 1980s in Brooklyn. The irony of that naming is something Fort Greene residents lived with every day. The poet who wrote about democracy and dignity, the building where dignity was one of the hardest things to hold on to. Fort Greene was not always dangerous. In the 1950s and 60s, it had been a working-class neighborhood with a strong black community, families who had migrated from the South during the Great Migration, who had built lives in Brooklyn, who owned small businesses and attended the same churches and sent their children to the same schools. The neighborhood had culture. The Brooklyn Academy of Music sat on Lafayette Avenue. Fort Greene Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the same man who designed Central Park, gave the neighborhood green space and dignity. The Fort Greene houses, built in the 1940s, had originally been considered a model of public housing: clean, safe, well-managed. Then the money left. As white families fled Brooklyn for the suburbs through the 1960s, the city's investment in Fort Greene's infrastructure went with them. Buildings that had been maintained fell into disrepair. Schools that had been funded were starved of resources. The economic floor that had held the community stable began to crack. By the 1970s, Fort Greene was struggling. By the time Benjamin O'Garrow was a teenager in the early 1980s, the crack cocaine epidemic had finished what the disinvestment had started. Crack changed Fort Greene the way it changed every black neighborhood in New York. Not gradually, overnight. Suddenly, there was a drug that cost less than a meal, but created the kind of addiction that made people sell everything they owned. Suddenly, there was money, more money than most residents had ever seen, available on corners to young men who were willing to do what it took to get it. The violence that came with it was specific and relentless. Benjamin O'Garrow grew up in all of that. He made a specific decision about what kind of man he was going to be. Not a dealer, not someone who stood on a corner selling to addicts, not a kingpin building a distribution network that required management and discipline and the careful cultivation of supplier relationships. A stick-up kid, the most feared kind of criminal in the underground economy, because he didn't follow any of its rules. Dealers had codes. There were things you didn't do. You didn't rob civilians. You didn't bring violence near children. You didn't target the wrong people. Kingpins had alliances, agreements, territories that were respected because respecting them was in everyone's interest. Stick-up kids operated outside all of it. They robbed dealers, robbed runners, robbed anyone who was carrying something worth taking. What made Killer Ben different from other stick-up kids in a burrow full of dangerous men was his fearlessness. Not recklessness, fearlessness. There is a difference. Reckless men take stupid risks because they don't fully process consequences. Fearless men take calculated risks because they have decided that consequences don't change what they're going to do anyway. Benjamin O'Garrow was the second kind. He would walk into situations that other men would assess and walk away from. He would target people who other stick-up kids considered untouchable because nobody was untouchable to Killer Ben. He operated by a single principle. If you had it, he could take it. The reputation spread through Brooklyn the way reputations spread, through stories, through accounts, circulating in prison yards and on corners, and through the oral history that the streets maintain about the men who matter. By the time he was in his early 20s, Benjamin O'Garrow's name carried weight that most men spend entire careers trying to accumulate. He had earned it the hard way, the only way he knew. Here is the detail that separates Killer Ben from every other Brooklyn stick-up kid. In the mid-1980s, a DJ named Eric B. was building something new. He had found a rapper from Wyandanch, Long Island, a young man who called himself Rakim Allah, whose lyrical sophistication was unlike anything that had existed in hip-hop before. Where other rappers of the era used simple rhyme patterns and straightforward storytelling, Rakim moved between bars with a fluid, almost jazz-like rhythm. He referenced philosophy and scripture. He approached the microphone with the calm authority of a man who knew he was the best in the room. Together, Eric B. and Rakim were building what would become one of the greatest debut albums in the history of American music. They called it Paid in Full, and the name came from a specific source. The Paid in Full Posse was a real organization, a notorious New York collective of street figures and rappers who moved through the same world simultaneously. Men who existed at the intersection of hip-hop culture and the underground economy. Men who were present at the same parties, the same clubs, the same corners, where the music and the streets overlapped. The Paid in Full Posse included Kool G Rap, one of the most technically gifted rappers of the era, Freddie Fox, an MC whose intensity was unmatched, and two men who were not rappers at all, Killer Ben, and a man from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, who the streets called 50 Cent. His real name was Kelvin Martin, and the reason they called him 50 Cent had nothing to do with money in the way most people think about money. Kelvin Martin would rob you. He would take your jewelry. He would take your valuables. He would take everything you had on you. And then he would leave you 50 cents. Not because he needed the money, because he wanted you to know that he had taken everything else and left you with almost nothing deliberately. The 50 cents was the message. The 50 cents was the humiliation. The 50 cents said this: I could have taken this too. I chose not to. That choice is mine. Your dignity is mine. It was psychological warfare, conducted one robbery at a time. His exploits became legendary across New York in the mid-1980s. They were covered by local media and referenced in hip-hop lyrics before any rapper named Curtis Jackson ever existed. When Curtis Jackson from Queens decided to take a stage name in the late 1990s, He didn't invent the name 50 Cent. He borrowed it, specifically, deliberately. He said so publicly. The name was inspired by Kelvin Martin, a 1980s Brooklyn robber known as 50 Cent. I chose it because it says everything I want it to say. I'm the same kind of person 50 Cent was. The most successful rapper in the world in the early 2000s, the man who built a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had named himself after a Brooklyn stick-up kid who ran in the same circle as Killer Ben. That is the world Killer Ben moved in. Not just a stick-up kid on a corner, a man whose crew, whose combination of street credibility and cultural presence was powerful enough that the greatest MC in hip-hop put them on his album cover, and powerful enough that the name of one of his running partners became the most famous stage name in the history of rap music. 1988. Benjamin O'Garrow is 19 years old. By now, his reputation in Fort Greene is fully established. His name circulates through the streets the way dangerous reputations circulate, through stories told on corners, through accounts passed between men in prison yards, through the oral history Brooklyn maintains about men who operate at the level Killer Ben operates. He is not yet 20 years old, and he is already someone that grown men in Fort Greene speak about carefully. Then, in a Fort Greene playground, he faces the situation that will define everything that follows. A shootout erupts. What started it is not fully documented in any public record. Disputes in that world rarely are. What is documented, reported by DNA Info, and circulated through every account of Killer Ben's life is what happened in the middle of it. Killer Ben, surrounded and under fire in a playground full of children, grabbed a 4-year-old child and used that child as a human shield, not in a moment of confusion that could be explained away. Deliberately, calculated, the child was cover. That detail became the defining fact of how the rest of his short life would be understood. In a world where violent men are judged by a specific code, where there are things you do and things you don't do, lines that even the most feared men are expected to respect, using a 4-year-old child as a shield crossed every line simultaneously. The people who respected Killer Ben respected him anyway. His reputation was too established, his standing too real, to be fully erased by one act. But the act was never forgotten, never fully defended. It sat in the middle of the Killer Ben mythology, the way uncomfortable truths sit, acknowledged, contextualized, and ultimately irreducible. He was convicted of attempting to murder a police officer, sentenced to federal prison. He went away in 1988 at age 19. He would not walk the streets of Fort Greene again for 7 years. And while he sat in that cell, the cost of being Killer Ben arrived at his family's door. 1990, Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Killer Ben is in prison. His brother, a younger man not connected to the street life the way Ben was, not someone who had chosen what Benjamin had chosen, gets into a dispute. A shootout. Details absorbed into the incomplete record that Fort Greene keeps about its most painful moments. But the men involved in that dispute know the family name. They know what it means. They know where the O'Garrows live. That same night, they come to the front door. They shoot it up. Killer Ben's youngest brother, a child, is killed. An innocent boy. Never a gang member. Never involved in anything his older brother had built. Dead because of the name he carried at birth. Dead because reputation in that world does not stay contained to the person who earned it. It radiates outward to the family, to the address, to everyone associated with the name. Ben is somewhere in a federal prison when word reaches him. He cannot go home. He cannot bury his brother. He cannot be present for the grief that sweeps through his family. He cannot do the thing that every instinct he has developed over 19 years of life in Fort Greene tells him needs to be done next. He sits with it, in a cell, for years. The mural that Fort Greene would eventually paint in his honor, the bright-faced young man with the sharp jaw and the sharp hairline, the words "a cut above the rest" beneath his dates, does not show any of that weight. Murals show the legend, not what it cost. 1995. 7 years after he went in, Killer Ben comes home. Fort Greene has changed while he was gone. Or more accurately, it has continued the transformation that was already underway when he left. The crack epidemic has peaked and begun to give way to heroin. The open-air markets that had defined the late 80s drug trade are being restructured under the pressure of federal enforcement. But the streets are still the streets. And hip-hop, which had been an underground New York phenomenon when Killer Ben went to prison, has become something else entirely while he was away. Hip-hop is now public, visible, and profitable. Biggie Smalls is about to release Ready to Die, the debut album that will make Christopher Wallace from Bed-Stuy the most celebrated rapper in America. Jay-Z is recording in studios across Brooklyn. The Source Awards, the biggest annual night in hip-hop, are bringing the entire industry to Manhattan. And the artists moving through that world are wearing wealth publicly. Gold chains, diamond crosses, jewelry that cost tens of thousands of dollars, worn openly, displayed deliberately because the jewelry was both real wealth and proof of authenticity. It said, "I came from where I said I came from. I built what I said I built." Killer Ben looked at all of that and saw opportunity. Opportunity. His name was already part of the mythology. A popular 1991 song had mentioned him. Rakim had put him on an album cover. In the prison yards and on the corners where the real New York oral history lives, Killer Ben was a name that carried weight. But weight doesn't pay rent. He went back to what he knew, the streets of Fort Greene, the networks he had built before he went away, the fearlessness that had built his name, and he started robbing rappers. 1995, the Source Awards, Manhattan. The 1995 Source Awards are one of the most infamous nights in hip-hop history. The night Suge Knight took the stage and called out record executives who put themselves in their artists' videos, a thinly veiled shot at Diddy that ignited the East Coast-West Coast rivalry that would eventually cost both Tupac and Biggie their lives. That is the story everyone knows about that night. Here is the story nobody reported. Biggie Smalls is there with his junior mafia crew. An associate named Zach is wearing a gold chain. After the show, the chain is gone. No police report filed, no public acknowledgement. The kind of robbery that gets handled the way things get handled in that world, quietly, with the understanding that what happens next happens outside the legal system. Word comes back through the streets. Killer Ben had something to do with it. Benjamin O'Garrow, the man from the Walt Whitman houses, the man on Rakim's album cover, the man who had used a 4-year-old as a human shield and served 7 years and come home and gone straight back to the life, had robbed someone connected to the most famous rapper in New York. According to former NYPD detective and author Derek Parker, who documented this era in his book, Biggie and Killer Ben may have clashed directly in 1995, months before Ben was murdered. August 17, 1995, Myrtle Avenue, Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Benjamin O'Garrow is 26 years old. He is standing at a payphone on the street where he grew up, the street he went to prison from, the street he came home to, the street where he learned that mythology doesn't pay rent and went back to the life because the life was the only thing he fully knew how to do. He has been home from prison for less than a year. In that time, he has reestablished himself. The source awards robbery, the network of contacts he maintained through 7 years of federal incarceration, the reputation that had survived his absence and in some ways grown in it, because absence in that world sometimes amplifies a legend rather than diminishing it. He is standing at a payphone, having a conversation, and somewhere nearby, a man with a .40 caliber handgun is making his way toward Myrtle Avenue. The shot comes without warning. Benjamin O'Garo is shot dead at the payphone on Myrtle Avenue in the Walt Whitman House's neighborhood, 2 blocks from where he was born. 26 years old. The murder was never solved. No arrest was ever made. The circumstances, whether it was retaliation for the Source Awards robbery and the chain taken from Biggie's associate Zach, whether it was connected to the reported direct clash between Killer Ben and Biggie in those final months of 1995, whether it was something else entirely from the long list of enemies that a man like Killer Ben accumulates over a life lived the way he lived it, were never publicly established. Former New York Police Department detective Derek Parker documented in his book that Killer Ben and Biggie may have clashed in the months before his death. Parker was a working homicide detective in Brooklyn during this era. His account is the closest thing to a documented record of what the relationship between Killer Ben and the bad boy world looked like in those final months, but nobody was ever charged. The case stays open in the same way that cases like this always stay open in Fort Greene. Technically active, practically cold, the truth somewhere in the oral history of the streets rather than in any police file. Killer Ben died the way he lived, on his street, in his neighborhood, with no warning and no time to react. The phone call he was making when the shot came, nobody knows who was on the other end of the line. Nobody knows what the last words of Benjamin O'Garo were. Just the sound of a .40 caliber handgun on Myrtle Avenue. And then silence. Fort Greene, Brooklyn, today. On the corner of Vanderbilt and Myrtle Avenues, directly across from the Walt Whitman houses, where Benjamin O'Garo was born, grew up, went to prison, and came home, there is a mural. His face, young, a bright-faced young man with a square jaw and a sharp hairline. The face of someone who never made it to 30, who never had the chance to become whatever a man like Benjamin O'Garo might have become if the streets had given him more time. Above the image, the words that the people who loved him chose. Our never-ending love for you. Your memories will always shine through. Below the painting, a cut above the rest, and his dates. November 5th, 1968. August 17th, 1995, 26 years. That is all. The mural was painted by the community that knew him, that had grown up around him, that had watched him become Killer Ben and understood, the way communities that produce men like him always understand, that the legend and the man were two different things, that the man had a mother, had brothers, had a birthday and a childhood before he had a reputation. The mural was defaced by people who felt that painting a tribute to a man convicted of attempted murder who had used a 4-year-old child as a human shield was the wrong message for a neighborhood still trying to find its way forward. They had a point, and then the mural was repainted by people who felt that Fort Greene had the right to remember its own, in full, with complexity, without the sanitized version of history that pretends communities do not produce men like Killer Ben and do not grieve them when they are gone. They also had a point. Both things can be true simultaneously. The man was complicated. The legend was real. The grief was genuine. Fort Greene painted him back on the wall, and Rakim had already made sure that the name survived beyond the wall. The God MC, who changed what rap could be, who brought a level of lyrical intelligence to hip-hop that nobody had brought before, who is considered by serious students of the music to be the greatest rapper who ever lived, had put Killer Ben in his songs, had put him on his album cover, had acknowledged him as part of the world that produced both the music and the violence, the crack-era Brooklyn energy that defined everything Rakim was speaking to. Tragedy Gaddafi, one of the most respected lyricists in New York hip-hop, had put him in a verse, bidded with Killer Ben and the real 50 Men. The original 50 Cent, not Curtis Jackson, the real man who carried that name before it became one of the most famous brands in entertainment history, had run in the same circle. Kelvin Martin, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, the man who would rob you and leave you 50 cents because the 50 cents was the message, because your humiliation was part of the transaction, because the point was never just the money. Curtis Jackson named himself after that man, said publicly, "I'm the same kind of person 50 Cent was, the most commercially successful rapper of the 2000s, the man who turned Get Rich or Die Tryin' into 12 million album sales, the man who survived 9 bullets in a South Jamaica parking lot and used the story to build a global brand, named himself after someone from the same world as Killer Ben. That is the world Benjamin O'Garrow moved in. Not a footnote, not a cautionary tale. A man who was genuinely part of the cultural DNA of the era that produced the music your entire generation listened to. He robbed every rapper in New York. He got put on an album cover by the greatest MC who ever lived. His running partner's nickname became the most famous stage name in the history of rap music. And he died in a phone booth on Myrtle Avenue at 26 years old. The mural is still there, defaced and repainted. Fort Greene remembers. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them. Harlem. A rooftop. A summer night. The city is spread out below like a map of everything a young man from these streets could want. Music coming up from somewhere. The specific sound of Harlem at night. Alive, electric. The kind of energy that makes you feel like nothing bad can happen when the whole neighborhood is out and everyone knows your name. And everyone knows this name. DJ Louvie B is on the mic below. He shouts it out. The crowd responds. A young man on that rooftop hears his name called and feels exactly what 19 feels like when you have already done what most men twice your age never manage. He is not wearing his bulletproof vest tonight. He decided to leave it behind, just for tonight. He wanted to feel what it was like to be a kid again. No vest, no plays to make, no crew to manage, no connect to answer to, no rivals circling, just a rooftop, a summer night, his name in the DJ's mouth. Harlem spread out below him. He has already stamped himself, already put the man who will eventually become the most famous name in Harlem street history into the game. Already taught that man everything he knows about how to move, how to carry himself, how to build something real in these streets. All of it, before 19 years old. And on this night, his mother's birthday, he is standing on a rooftop without his vest, feeling like nothing can touch him. The men who have been watching him all night are waiting for exactly this moment. His name was Donald Johnson. The streets of Harlem called him L.A. And what happened on that rooftop changed everything that came after, including the story the world knows as Paid in Full. Before there was a Paid in Full, before there was AZ and Rich and Alpo and the specific mythology that a movie would eventually build around the Harlem drug era of the 1980s, there was L.A. Donald Johnson grew up on Lincoln Avenue in Harlem. That's where the name came from. Not an alias chosen for effect, not a nickname earned in the streets. The block where he grew up, L.A., Lincoln Avenue. Simple as that. He was the kind of boy that every Harlem block produces, the one who sees more than the others, who absorbs what's around him faster, who watches the older men moving through the neighborhood and understands, before anyone explains it to him, what they have and how they got it. He saw the old fellas carrying wads of cash. He knew what that meant. He told his friend Dwop exactly what he was going to get. And then he went about getting it. He started where most teenagers in that world start, with a scheme. He and his friends selling fake hash, posting up outside spots known for having good product and catching traffic that was looking for something real. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it got back to them. Eventually, everyone was doing the same scheme, and it was dead. A lesser person quits here. L.A. was not a lesser person. He found his way to some good product, real weed, and started moving it the right way. In school, to his friends, building a customer base the way you build any customer base, through quality and reliability, and the specific trust that comes from never burning the people who depend on you. But weed was the beginning, not the destination. The destination revealed itself when a friend named D introduced L.A. to something different, pure fish-scale cocaine. And L.A. never looked back. Mac brought L.A. and Dwop into a room. The first time around, the smell and the chemicals, the specific sensory experience of cutting and mixing cocaine made Dwop sick to his stomach. L.A. didn't flinch. They finished, put red tape on the bags, and it was on. From that first batch, from that room where Dwop couldn't keep his stomach settled and L.A. was already calculating what came next, a phenomenal run began. Not slowly, not gradually, immediately. Because L.A. understood something about this business that most people entering it never fully grasp. A drug will sell itself. What separates the men who move weight from the men who move corners is not the product. It's how far a person is willing to take it, how early they get up, how far they'll drive, how consistently they show up. From blizzard to 99 degrees, L.A. was outside, every day. In the mix, getting that paper. He learned the game and took it to the next level. The OGs, the older men who had been running Harlem before L.A., was old enough to be in the streets, respected him. Not because he was large or imposing or violent, because he was ahead of his time. 15 years old, pulling out a nickel any given Sunday, passing it to his friend like it was nothing, paying people's rent, covering lawyer fees, taking on grown man responsibilities and grown man risk before he could legally drive the cars he was parking outside his building. He had a cab driver on standby, a driver on call, paid well to be available, driving L.A. around the whole city while he made plays, while he conducted business, while he moved through Harlem with the specific efficiency of a young man who understood that time was money and wasted movement was wasted money. He was 15 years old. L.A. was the first one in the hood to rock Butters. That detail matters. In the specific culture of Harlem in the early 1980s, where what you wore and what you drove announced what you were before you said a word, being first mattered enormously. Being the one who set the standard rather than followed it told the neighborhood something specific about the man wearing the shoes. He made everyone want Dirtbox Tims when he came through. He was the only young boy in the hood with his own wheels. When he came flying down the street, the first one to come through with the system blasting, heads turned. And then he saw the S900 Turbo. He bought it. And here is the specific detail that tells you everything about who LA was at this age. He left the price tag on the car, not because he forgot, not because he was careless, because he wanted everyone who saw it to know exactly how he was carrying it. His baby mother was pushing a red Porsche. He wasn't even old enough to drink or drive, in and out of dealerships with straight cash. This is a teenager from Lincoln Avenue, moving through Harlem with the specific confidence of someone who has already calculated what he is worth and found the number acceptable. He challenged his friend D to try to get $100,000. Friendly competition, men pushing each other toward the next level the way that young men in that world do, not through envy, but through the specific ambition of people who see what's possible and decide to reach for it together. He treated everyone around him fly, gave generously, put people in position, brought men into his circle who needed to be brought up. That generosity, that specific quality of a man who sees his own success as something to be shared, would eventually be the thing that cost him everything. Rich Porter came into the story early. LA put him in the game, not as an employee, not as a worker to be managed, as a partner, as a business associate who deserved to be treated with the respect that partnership implies. In his own words, captured in the Membersonly account of this era, Rich Porter was treated fairly, like a business partner. They kept each other on their toes. Rich wanted to floss like LA, so they flossed together. When LA copped something new, Rich saw something to keep up with him. And when Rich went to finance what he needed to keep up, it was clean. It was earned. They were good for each other. LA was a mentor, in the truest sense of the word, not just showing Rich how the product moved, but showing him how to carry himself, how to dress, how to think about the game as a business rather than a corner operation, how to build something that grew instead of something that stayed small. Rich Porter always told LA one thing: stay off the rooftop. The rooftop in Harlem was a specific kind of vulnerability, an exposed position, a place where you could be seen from multiple angles without seeing what was coming. Rich understood something about LA's character that LA couldn't always see in himself. He was too comfortable, too confident, too certain that the respect he had earned would protect him from the men who didn't respect him. LA didn't always listen, but the relationship between them, the specific mentorship that LA provided to Rich Porter before anyone outside Harlem knew who Rich Porter was, is the detail that changes the way you understand the entire Paid in Full story. The world knows Rich Porter. Rich Porter learned from LA. Before Paid in Full, there was this. LA's biggest vulnerability was his heart. He gave too freely. He brought too many people into his circle. He extended trust to men who had not earned it, and he extended generosity to men who would use the information that generosity provided to destroy him. His circle expanded, and as circles expand, they dilute. The loyalty and structure and genuine trust that the original crew was built on, the thing that made the operation function as a unit rather than a collection of individuals, got watered down with new faces. Snakes who waited, men who studied how LA moved, who he dealt with, where his money was, what his plays looked like, and filed all of it away for the right moment. One of those men was Ron Mack. Ron Mack was older. He had been away in prison while LA was building. When he came home and saw that the young workers were in position, that LA was the man, that the operation he had expected to step back into had been transformed by teenagers into something he did not recognize, he could not accept it. He had no choice but to get work from the young bulls, and it ate him alive. LA, in a move that his own crew could not understand, in a move that people watching from the outside could only explain as either generosity or blindness, gave Ron Mack his connect. Overnight, Ron Mack was a boss. He knew LA's formula down to the specific. Every play, every drop-off spot, every move. He knew LA's baby mother. He was locked in, and he used all of it. Ron Mack set up shop directly across from LA's spots, started taking his customers, got into LA's workers' ears, and gave them product to move behind LA's back. Slowly, methodically, draining LA's operation from the inside while appearing on the outside to be just another operator in the neighborhood. When LA finally saw what was happening, he cut Ron Mack off. But cutting off a man who knows everything about your operation is not the same as cutting off a man who knows nothing. Ron Mack was stuck, owed money to everyone, owed the connect, couldn't get $1 from the street. And when a man with nothing to lose decides to use the information he has, the consequences are specific and devastating. Ron Mack robbed LA's mother's house. Not just robbed it, put his hands on her. When LA found out, the response was immediate. 3 cars deep through Harlem, looking for answers, looking for the man who had gone into his mother's house, who had put his hands on her, who had taken from the woman who had nothing to do with any of this. A neighbor pointed to pictures. Ron Mack. LA put $10,000 on his head. But law enforcement moved first. Ron Mack ended up behind bars before anyone else could get to him. The others who had broken into LA's mother's house, the ones who had been with Ron Mack, were still walking around Harlem, still moving through the neighborhood like everything was sweet, like LA was finished, like the man who had been the first to rock Butters, who had his baby mother in a red Porsche, who had left the price tag on the S900 Turbo, was no longer a factor. LA found one of them. Shots were exchanged. The man had a vest on and fired back. Both sides exchanged shots until LA and his crew broke out. And once gunplay is involved, there is no turning back. The beef had its own momentum now, separate from any original dispute, separate from Ron Mack being behind bars. The men who had been at that house were still out there, still watching. L.A. was still wearing his vest every night because Rich had always told him, stay off the rooftop, stay protected, the streets are always watching. And for a while, L.A. listened. Things got better. All of his enemies were behind bars. Money was coming in again. The operation that had been disrupted by Ron Mack's betrayal had stabilized. L.A. had borrowed $10,000 from DeWap during the worst of it. A month later, it was back to the program. Money flowing, things looking great. He started getting comfortable. Friends told him to lay low. The beef ain't over. The streets are always watching. He heard them. He just didn't listen. His mother's birthday. One of those summer nights in Harlem where the city feels completely alive, and the idea that anything bad can happen seems impossible. Music coming up from below, people out, the neighborhood doing what Harlem does on the best nights of summer. L.A. took off his bulletproof vest. Just for tonight. He slid to the rooftop alone. No vest, no crew around him, no protection beyond the reputation he had built in these streets. DJ Louvie B was on the MIC. He shouted L.A. out. And for a moment, just one moment, Donald L.A. Johnson was exactly what he was, a 19-year-old kid from Lincoln Avenue in Harlem on his mother's birthday, on top of the world. The men who had been watching him all night were watching. They waited for the right time. The shots went off. L.A. ran with the crowd, but it was too late. The hitters moved toward him, let him have it. He walked to his car, filled with bullets, too weak to stand on his feet. He fell against the car. Two friends noticed, helped him into the vehicle, drove toward the hospital. In the car, barely conscious, L.A. kept saying one thing. He couldn't die tonight. It was his mother's birthday. He had a mink coat to give her. Donald L.A. Johnson died at 19 years old, on his mother's birthday, in Harlem, the youngest to ever do it. The people who loved L.A. came to pay respect. Friends visited his mother, left money, came to mourn the boy who had put so many of them in position, who had paid their rent and their lawyer fees, who had made everyone around him fly. Rich Porter paid for L.A.'s funeral, and then Rich Porter stopped by the stash, and he continued running L.A.'s operation, wasted no time, bought all types of cars and jewelry. If you asked him, he was the next man up. That detail is the specific detail that tells you everything about what the Harlem crack era actually was. L.A. put Rich Porter in the game, taught him how to move, treated him like a partner, showed him how to build something real in these streets. And when L.A. died, Rich Porter inherited everything L.A. had built: the stash, the operation, the relationships, the specific organizational knowledge that L.A. had spent his teenage years developing. Rich Porter became Rich Porter on the foundation that L.A. had laid. The world knows Paid in Full. The world knows Rich Porter and Ozzie Faison and Alpo Martinez. The world does not know the 19-year-old from Lincoln Avenue who taught the most famous name in Harlem's drug history how to move. His mother's birthday, a mink coat sitting somewhere, never delivered. That is Donald L.A. Johnson, Harlem's most forgotten legend. Harlem in the early to mid-1980s was producing young men at a speed that the legitimate economy couldn't absorb. Boys who were ahead of their time, who saw supply chains and customer bases and organizational structure in a world that was offering them nothing formal to apply those instincts to. L.A. saw it at 12, at 13, at 14. By 15, he was the only young boy in the hood with his own wheels. By 17, his baby mother was pushing a red Porsche. By 18, he had put the man who would eventually become Harlem's most famous street legend into the game and was teaching him everything he knew. He was 19 when it ended, on his mother's birthday, without his vest, on a rooftop, feeling like a kid for the first time in years. Rich Porter said something later that tells you what L.A. meant to him and to Harlem. He stopped by the stash, not out of disrespect, out of the specific understanding that the game doesn't stop, that the operation L.A. built was the operation Rich inherited, that the best way to honor a man who put you in position is to take what he built and make it bigger. Rich did that for a while, until Alpo, until the story that the world calls Paid in Full played out exactly the way the streets always play out. But before any of that, before Rich Porter was Rich Porter, before Paid in Full, before Alpo, before Ozzie, before the movie and the mythology and the songs, there was a boy from Lincoln Avenue who left his vest at home on his mother's birthday, who wanted to be a kid for one night, and couldn't die because he had a mink coat to deliver. Donald L.A. Johnson, 19 years old. Harlem never forgot him. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them.